world that prices always rise. If you were to look at what people think are the most important things to avoid in an economy, so if you were to search through, say, news stories and look for the most commonly used economic terms, you would see that inflation is one of the most feared things. For whatever reason, people seem to fear the presence of inflation. And so what we want to do in this chapter is we want to talk first about what causes inflation, and then we want to talk about what impact it has on an economy, and think about some of the costs that inflation can impose on an economy. We're going to be thinking in this chapter about what's referred to as the quantity theory of money. And we'll discuss that more here in just a little bit, but we're going to be thinking about the relationship between how much money there is in the economy. Remember, that's controlled by the Fed. Not precisely, but they're the ones that are charged with controlling it. And then what happens to the inflation rate. So we're going to be thinking about what we call a classical theory of inflation. And this is a theory that's attributable to David Hume, an early economist. What we want to do first is start by thinking about what happens if some price goes up. So let's suppose that a price increases from one year to the next. And maybe this is the price of gasoline. We could think about that. Well, what we know is, we've talked about the demand and supply model, and so we know that probably the first place to start if we're thinking about why a price goes up is to think about what happens with demand and supply. So if you think about that basic demand and supply model, where we've got price up here and quantity down there, there are a couple of things that will drive price up. The first is that we could have an increase in demand from D1 to D2. That would drive our price up. If our price started here, our price is going to be driven up. So that's the first thing. It could be, if we observe price, in this chapter, we're going to talk about money growth and inflation. So if you've been watching the videos, if you've been keeping up, then what you probably realize is that at the early part of the semester, we talked about different measures of the health of an economy. So we talked about how to measure the price level with the CPI or the GDP deflator, and we talked about how to measure the income of a nation with GDP, nominal GDP and real GDP. We've talked about unemployment, and really what we were discussing were how those measures worked, how they were constructed, some of the strengths of them and the weaknesses, but we didn't really talk about what causes the price level to go up or down, or what causes the unemployment rate to rise. We did, in unemployment, we did talk a little bit about some of the causes of frictional and structural unemployment, so I guess we did there. But we didn't talk very much at all about what causes incomes to go up or down. We will in a future video. What we want to do now is focus really on what causes the price level to rise, to increase or decrease, what causes us to have inflation or deflation. Remember that we can measure inflation or deflation by looking at the percent change in either the GDP deflator or the CPI. And if you look at historically, at least in the United States, we've had inflation averaging probably for the last 60 years, averaging somewhere 4 or 5%. Some months it's a little bit higher, some months it's lower. And there are probably some months mixed in there where we've actually had some deflation. But if you were to go back and look at the 1800s, what you would see were periods of deflation, long periods of deflation. So it is not the case that it's the natural order of the world that prices always rise. If you were to look at what people think are the most important things to avoid in an economy, so if you were to search through, say, news stories and look for the most commonly used economic terms, you would see that inflation is one of the most feared things. For whatever reason, people seem to fear the presence of inflation. And so what we want to do in this chapter is we want to talk first about what causes inflation, and then we want to talk about